So this is a talk for all of the beginners out there. For all of you who are just getting started with React, or maybe just even getting started with JavaScript, this talk is for you. If you're nervous about creating things with React, or if you feel overwhelmed, or like you have no idea what you're doing, this talk will hopefully provide you with a bit of solace, because a year ago, all of the terrible things that you can possibly do when creating a React app, I did them, and I survived. This talk is also for those of you who've been working with React and JavaScript for a while, because I'm sure that someday you'll be helping guide someone through the process of discovering React and learning to love JavaScript. I'll admit that it's a little scary standing up here about to enumerate all of the things that I messed up. Admitting ignorance and dealing with the shame that comes with that is something that I struggle with, and it's something that I'm working on, obviously, as I'm standing here in front of you. So what I ask from you as an audience is kindness and consideration, not just for me, but for all of the people that you work with and collaborate with in open source. Be kind and considerate to the beginners, because being a beginner is weird and scary. So about a year ago, I found myself in this odd situation. My task was to create a messaging system. Imagine Gmail, basically. And it was my job to create this messaging system with a Rails backend and a React frontend, and to deliver this in 6 weeks' time. I was mostly on my own for the project. The person reviewing my pull requests was a really fantastic Rails developer, but he was less experienced with JavaScript. He'd never looked at React, and neither had I. And in fact, I'd never actually looked at a JavaScript framework before. I was really unsure as to why I'd ever want to use one. I knew that they were cool, and I knew that people were really into them, but they didn't really fit into my concept of web development at the time. To give you an idea of my background, at the time, I was fairly fresh out of Inspiral Dev Academy. So that's a developer bootcamp in New Zealand, and during my time there, I learned Ruby and Rails, a bit of ES5 vanilla JavaScript, and some jQuery. Before going to Dev Academy, I'd spent about a year and a half making WordPress themes. So I was really at home writing server-side rendered views with very little JavaScript. I was okay with a bit of jQuery, but I viewed it as something to be sort of sprinkled on top of my code. I didn't really have a concept of using JavaScript to do more than make an element appear or disappear from the page. And I was also really afraid of JavaScript. I tried to teach myself a few times with Code Academy, but I'd never been able to make it stick. I'd always just given up. Only a month before I started on the project, I'd broken down crying in class one day because I just didn't understand JavaScript. The syntax was weird, it didn't have Ruby's lovely standard library, and I just had no idea what this was. So my education and experience, it just hadn't covered much in terms of complex front-end challenges. I was working with my knowledge of server-side programming and my cobbled together knowledge of the front end, which was mostly really good CSS that made things look cool, and enough jQuery to get by. So back to my task. If anyone has been thinking about how you would create Gmail with React, you can probably appreciate the dynamic complexity there, right? So there's lots of things I need to keep track of. A list of messages with senders and receivers, the state of each message, whether it's read or unread. And there's users too, so I have to think about them, their names and their avatars. We need to compose a message and validate that all the correct info is there. There's an address book feature to handle, and we need to propagate errors to the view as well. So there's a whole lot of stuff in there, right? And the astute amongst you have already solved my problem. I'd probably need something to help me manage my state and handle user interactions with my app. I'd probably want to look into something like Flux or Redux, something that's going to limit how badly I can mess up by preventing side effects. Some of you are thinking that I would also need immutable. And all of you are right, I did need those things, and people told me that. A developer who I didn't work with, but to whom I mentioned the project, said, yeah, you're going to look into Redux probably. Another person who I didn't work with, but who was on another project, said, yeah, you're going to need Flux. But the problem was that I didn't really understand why I needed those things, because I had a bunch of unknown unknowns and a couple of unknown knowns, and just a general lack of knowledge standing in my way. So if you're not familiar with those concepts, let me show you this diagram. And this is my favorite diagram, because it perfectly describes to me the learning process, particularly when it comes to programming. So a concept will start out as an unknown unknown, which is exactly what it sounds like. You have no idea that this thing even exists. It then moves to become a known unknown. And for me, what that means is that I know of the concept, I've heard of it, maybe I know a little bit about it, but I don't really understand it very well. As you learn more about the concept, it becomes a known known, which is again exactly what it sounds like. You understand the concept and you are all good with it. You might also come across unknown knowns, and that's when you know something, but you weren't aware that you knew it. Perhaps you didn't know that it had a name, or you hadn't made all of the links in your brain until someone put a word to it for you. On the plane on the way here, I was reading this book, and I actually discovered an unknown known of mine. Apparently this year I accidentally learned lambda calculus. So I show this diagram because as I started learning React, I had to go through the process of discovering my unknown unknowns and turning them into known knowns. I was also working under a lot of assumptions brought over from my previous experiences, and I was about to have those assumptions shattered. So with that in mind, let me tell you about the mistakes that I made. The first major mistake that I made was that I manipulated the DOM with jQuery. As I said earlier, I was comfortable using jQuery to manipulate the DOM. That's kind of where I was at with JavaScript. When I needed to perform small changes to the DOM, like appending an element or showing a notification, I often stuck with this old habit of using jQuery to do that. Now, most of the time with React, that's a terrible idea. Manually altering the DOM like that just confuses React's virtual DOM, and that leads to bugs and general awfulness, so don't do that. But my use of jQuery to manipulate the DOM wasn't really the problem. It was the symptom of my problem. And the problem was that I didn't understand side effects, or the difference between declarative and imperative programming, or how those concepts even related to React. If someone at that stage had asked me what JavaScript looked like to me, I probably would have pointed them at something like this. So these days I'd look at that code and I'd say that's a piece of jQuery, and it's written in an imperative style, and it's performing a side effect. But back then, I would have just said, oh yeah, that's JavaScript. I had no idea of the implications of what I was dealing with. When I say imperative, I mean that in this code, I'm telling the computer how to achieve the thing that I want it to do. When I click this button, hide this element. And when I say side effect, I mean that this function is making changes to something that exists outside the scope of the function. In this case, it's the DOM. I'm not just dealing with local variables, and I might not get the same outcome every time I call this function. So hopefully you can appreciate that this was my mental model of JavaScript, and I didn't know that it could be any other way. Now, there's certainly a time and a place for imperative code and side effects, but generally that's not inside a React component. General disclaimer, I won't go so far as to say that jQuery should never be used with React, but definitely use it with caution, and at all costs, if you find yourself tempted to manipulate the DOM, don't do it. Use React's lifecycle methods. So if you find yourself wanting to do that, to manipulate the DOM directly, appending things or hiding things or changing the inner HTML of an element, it's time to stop and think, because you might not be doing things in the React way. You might be operating under assumptions that you have about JavaScript, and it might be time to try something different. So what is that something different? I mentioned briefly declarative style, and when I finally figured this out, I have to say that it was pretty mind-blowing. When I was writing code in an imperative style, I was supplying the computer with instructions on how to get into the state that I wanted my UI to be in. Writing code in a declarative style means that I describe what I want my elements to do given a certain state. I'm telling the computer what I want, but I'm not telling it how to do that. The code here is similar to the last example. When I click a button, an element disappears from the view. But in this case, I'm not actually making any direct changes to the DOM. I'm letting React handle that for me. I'm saying that given a certain state, display or hide the text, but I'm not telling it how to do that. And that's a really powerful way to go about writing code, and I'm really glad that React encourages us to do this. Writing in a declarative style allows for fewer side effects, and that often means fewer bugs. Writing in a declarative style means that I'm saved from myself, really, because there's fewer ways that I can mess things up. It's kind of like giving directions versus giving you an address. So, for example, if I'm inviting you to a party at my house, you need to get there. There's a couple of ways I can give you that information. I can give you directions to my house, and that would be the imperative way of doing this. Something like, well, first you need to get on a plane to New Zealand, and then you need to fly into Auckland, and then change to Wellington, and then outside of the airport you turn left, and then you carry on until you get to the roundabout, and so on. And there's already a few issues there, right? So you might not be coming from the airport, you might be coming from the bus station across town. I might mess up the directions and tell you to turn left when you want to take a right. So my other option is to tell you I live at 742 Evergreen Terrace, Newtown, Wellington, and trust you to find your way there. And that would be the declarative way to do it. You might use Google Maps or a GPS or a paper map or just hitchhike until you get there, and I don't care as long as you arrive. So back to React. When I was writing my app, I was stuck in this habit of thinking about what actions I needed to perform step by step to get my UI looking the way it should for a given state. And that led me to fall back into what I knew, which was JavaScript written in this imperative style. It's not that imperative programming is inherently bad, it's just that I make a lot of mistakes. So the fewer instructions I have to give, the better. React abstracts that layer away from us, and I should have embraced the power of React instead of fighting against it. So when you're writing your app, if you notice that you're writing imperative code, I'd encourage you to stop and think. Are you describing how your app should be, or are you telling it how to get that way? Because if it's the latter, it's time for a rethink. I made lots of mistakes when it came to managing my components. My components were often big and unwieldy. I had a lot of trouble managing the hierarchy and the data flow between them. So that sounds like a messy nightmare, so let's unpack that a little. For starters, why were my components so big? Mainly, I was afraid to split them up. As I was writing this app, I found that more components led to more pain and more frustration. I was already experiencing a lot of pain and frustration, and I didn't want to cause myself more. So I tried to limit the number of components that I was using. That wasn't really the problem, though. That, again, was the symptom of a problem. So some of you might have guessed that the source of my pain was managing the messages sent between my components. The problem was I didn't understand how to manage the flow of data through my application. I had no idea how to manage state or user interactions in a sensible way. And to be quite honest, I actually didn't even grok the notion of my front end having its own flow of data, and that being something that would require management. I told you earlier that people had advised me to look into Flux or Redux, and so I did. I looked into Flux because a year ago that seemed to be the library that I was able to find the most information on. I watched this video from Facebook, and I looked at some tutorials, and then I tried to implement it in my app. And I'm pretty sure there's still a branch floating around somewhere called Attempt at Flux. Sadly, I didn't have much success. The tutorials that I was looking at, they were probably really excellent, but they tended to assume a lot more knowledge than I had at the time. And that was a really frustrating hurdle for me. Being apparently too stupid to even understand the tutorial made me feel really crappy about myself and my ability to do my job. So the news is much better these days. Thanks to the community, there's a much wider variety of tutorials available. and they're aimed at lots of different people coming to React from lots of different backgrounds. Those contributions are extremely valuable because they make React a lot more accessible to people from all sorts of backgrounds, and that's exactly what we want because diverse backgrounds means diverse experiences and prior knowledge and more creativity. I think I had a lot of trouble understanding Flux in part because of my previous experiences. In my world at the time, data was sent from a server-side controller and then just kind of plonked into a view for the user to see. And maybe you poked at it with a bit of JavaScript, but that was trivial and almost an afterthought. So when I watched these videos about Flux that described how it worked, it made sense to me at quite a high level, but I didn't seem to be able to apply the concept of Flux to the real-world applications sitting in front of me. Understanding that my UI had data flow and state was really hard to come to terms with. I know it probably seems obvious to most of you, but coming from my background, it just wasn't. Having not dealt with much interactivity before, realizing the complexity of my UI and how it fit together was quite a revelation. While I wrote this app, I had no idea how to manage the messages that I needed to send between components. I relied really heavily on the internal state of my components, and then I clumsily wired them together. So there were a lot of messages going back and forth, and my data flow certainly wasn't unidirectional. There was definitely not one single source of truth. It was really quite hodgepodge and ad hoc, and as you can imagine, that caused me a lot of bugs to deal with. There's a lot of talk at the moment about crafting and managing components, stateful components versus functional components. People saying that components should be small and focused, independent, reusable, whatever. And I'm yet to fall upon my preferred way of making components and composing them. But I can say that my component and state management skills are infinitely better now that I've learned to use Redux. Mostly though, what I learned was that my mental model of the front end and my assumptions about how it worked were totally wrong. I needed to totally reimagine my approach to UI problems so that I could fully embrace the React ecosystem. So if you're learning React and you're moving slightly beyond very simple UIs, spend some time looking up the tutorials available around Redux. If you're like me and you had similar notions of the front end being a place where data from the server was plonked, spend some time challenging those assumptions and discovering the real complexity of your UI concerns. Take the time to really understand the interactivity that your app requires and think about the messages that are going to need to be sent around your app and how you're going to manage them. Experiment with how you form your components and handle your hierarchy. And definitely don't be afraid, as I was, of creating too many components. Because I think if you're afraid of that, there might be a larger issue with your architecture that's causing that fear. And it's time to address that. I made lots of mistakes trying to make React and Rails work together nicely. Mostly looked like me trying to mash a square peg into a round hole. I really didn't know how the pieces of React and Rails work together. And I totally abused the React Rails gem. Can you blame me? I was scared and I was confused, and words like Rails and gem were really comforting to me because they were solid concepts that I could understand and latch onto. And I ran with them quite unwisely. Some of you might have worked with Rails API React front-end setup, and there's various ways to approach that problem. One popular setup is to have a standalone React app which makes requests to your Rails API. Some of you might have introduced React into an existing Rails project by dropping React components into your existing views. And both of those are really reasonable approaches, and I did neither of them. Instead, I used React Rails gem to basically drop my entire app into one Rails view. So I had something that looked like this. I had an action in my Rails controller that rendered an ERB file for me. And in that ERB file, I rendered a React component. Now that React component was basically my top-level component with a bunch of children nested underneath it and components conditionally shown based on some state. I didn't have any proper routing going on. I wasn't using React Router because I didn't know that it existed. And I wasn't organizing my components into separate Rails views either. So I wasn't making the best use of either Rails or React at that point. And that was really disappointing. These days you can actually get Rails and React working together really nicely if you're using the React Rails gem, because you can render a React component instead of your Rails view, like this. So you can do that from your controller. That's pretty nifty because you get all of the goodness of your Rails controllers, but you essentially replace your Rails views without much fuss. Unfortunately, that wasn't available when I first started using the gem. I guess my point here is that I didn't spend enough time figuring out how to make Rails and React work nicely together. I didn't even consider separating React from Rails, and frankly, that notion would have terrified me. So I picked the first thing that worked for me, and I ran with it. It felt a bit dodgy at the time, but I didn't really know what else to do, so I went with it. These days, I'd probably lean towards having an instance of a Rails API and working with a separate React app. But if you're in that situation, research and get advice on how to set things up properly for your needs. Spending time on that might actually reveal that you don't need a Rails instance. Perhaps you just need Firebase to store your data or something. But either way, I recommend drawing up a diagram of how your server and your front end work together, rather than just steaming on ahead like I did without much thought. I made a lot more mistakes while I was working on this project, but we don't have all day, so I'm going to skip ahead to the one that had the most impact for me. When I was put on this project, the stack had already been decided by someone else who wasn't actually working on the project. Now, I was new, and I didn't want to question authority too much, but I had some doubts as to whether React was the right choice for us at the time. Considering the time constraints upon us and our inexperience with React, it seemed like an odd choice. I got the feeling that React was chosen in this case because it was trendy and exciting. And that is a really mixed blessing. I know that it's unavoidable when new things come along, but when we choose to use tools because they're trendy and exciting, it means that we might look tools that are better suited to the job at hand. At the same time though, picking the new trendy tools gives us the opportunity to use them and apply them to different problems and to gauge their strengths and weaknesses and whether we like them. And I can't complain too much because learning React has had a huge impact on my life as a programmer. That said, if I were to do it again, I probably would have tried to either lean away from React or allocate a lot more time and resources so that my colleagues and I had more time to learn. Okay, so I've confessed my sins to the world. I hope that some of you feel a bit better about some of the bad things that you've done with React, because they're probably not as bad as mine. So let's talk about the good things. Learning React and messing up so many things has actually really helped me learn to love JavaScript. Once upon a time, I never, ever thought I would say that. I have 2 tattoos of rubies, and at the time I got them, people joked that I should get a JavaScript tattoo as well, and I laughed at them. But I think they might actually have the last laugh on that. Once I saw that JavaScript could be written in ways that wasn't the imperative spaghetti mess that I had always mentally associated with JavaScript, I grew to really love writing and using it. I've become a lot more interested in solving really complex front-end problems and creating maintainable and reusable components with React. I'm really looking forward to creating a React app at work in the near future and applying what I've learned to this new project. Beyond React, going through this process has changed how I program in other languages too. I'm better at Ruby, I'm better at CSS, I'm better at PHP because I've learned some really important concepts that have carried over to my other work. Learning React has also really kicked off a passion for me. I've become really immersed in functional reactive programming. I've explored the field a bit more now, and I've really gained an interest in observables. For the past 6 months, I've been working a lot with Cycle.js. I've created components and drivers for Cycle, and I've contributed them to the community. Recently, I made my first contribution to the Cycle core as well, and so I'm looking forward to doing more of that. It's unfortunate that I had to go through a lot of pain to get where I am right now with JavaScript, but I'm glad that it's happened. For those of you who are already great at React, I hope that I've given you a frame of reference for the assumptions that people might make when they approach a JavaScript framework for the first time. If you're working with someone who's looking at React for the first time, get to know them and their background before proceeding. Knowing where they're coming from will really help you identify the types of assumptions that they might tend to make, and you can guide them in the right direction. For anyone who's just beginning with React or getting started with JavaScript, my advice to you is to be really open to the idea that your assumptions are wrong, and you'll need to be prepared to learn new paradigms as you delve into the world. Particularly to those of you who haven't tackled complex front-end challenges before, it's really important that you approach React in a different way than you might be used to if you're, say, a Rails developer or a WordPress developer. Mostly, though, just go ahead and make things with React. And don't worry if you make the exact same screw-ups as I did, because you'll survive and you'll learn as well. At the start of my project, people gave me all sorts of advice, and I basically ignored it because I had no idea what they were talking about, and I just needed to get things done. I didn't have time to research more and find out what they meant. Ultimately, making the mistakes that I did was the best teacher. So sometimes you just have to let that happen, and it's okay. Thanks, everyone.